The chamber had 31 seats arranged in a half circle, and every one of them was full. The ceiling was high and pale, and designed to make whatever happened below it feel permanent. Marin Ose had sat in this room for 34 years. She knew the way the light came in from the upper panels, and turned every species' skin tone into something slightly wrong. She knew the particular silence that came before a vote, the way it stretched, the way it liked to be noticed. She did not look nervous. She had decided, 8 years ago, that she was done looking nervous in this room. The senior herald, a tall dren with 4 arms folded in formal arrangement, read the motion for the third and final time. The words were old words, translated from 17 languages, polished smooth by centuries of use. They were the words the conclave used when it wanted to make clear that a decision was not a mistake, but a correction. The motion was to remove humanity from the galactic conclave, permanently, without condition of return. The vote was not going to be close. Marin already knew this. She had counted the seats herself, 3 weeks ago, after the Veth situation became what the other ambassadors politely called the last incident. Before that, it had been the Terek water rights vote, where humanity abstained on principle, and then helped the losing side anyway. Before that, it had been the Olmec deforestation agreement, which humanity signed and then sent volunteers to undermine quietly on the ground. Before that, it had been a dozen smaller things, each one filed and remembered, stacked up like stones in a wall that the conclave had now decided was tall enough. The Veth had been the last stone. 6 months ago, the conclave voted to let the Veth expire. That was the diplomatic word. Expire. The Veth were a small species on a small world with no military and no resources anyone needed, and a life expectancy as a civilization measured now in decades rather than centuries. The conclave ran the numbers. Providing support would cost more than it returned. The motion to withdraw all aid passed 29-2, with humanity and 1 elderly Serenthi ambassador casting the only dissenting votes. Marin had gone home that night, sat in her apartment, and made a call she had been holding off on for 8 years. 2 weeks later, humanity had quietly relocated 400 Veth families to a station near the human border. Then 400 more. Then the whole remaining population, 11,000 people, moved with a logistical smoothness that suggested planning that predated the vote by a significant margin. The conclave noticed. The motion to expel humanity was filed the following week. The debate lasted 4 sessions. Marin sat through all of them. She listened to the arguments. Some of them were fair. Humanity did not follow procedure. Humanity made decisions based on feelings when the data said otherwise. Humanity had a habit of treating conclave consensus as a suggestion, rather than a law. Humanity had, 3 times in the last decade, created facts on the ground before the relevant committees had finished deliberating. All of this was true. Marin did not argue any of it. She had been given 30 minutes to speak in humanity's defense. She had used 7 of them, standing at the center podium with her hands at her sides. She said that humanity acknowledged the concerns. She said that humanity respected the process. She said that if the chamber decided the relationship was no longer workable, humanity would accept that decision and conduct itself accordingly. Then she sat down. 23 minutes of silence left on the clock, and she just sat down. The room had not known what to do with that. Now the voting light was on. 31 terminals, each ambassador pressing one of 2 options. The count took 11 seconds. The herald read the result in the standard 3 languages. 30-1. The 1 was Marin's own vote, cast against the motion. A formality, she had decided. A record. The room exhaled. There was no celebration. The conclave did not celebrate things like this, but there was a particular quality of relief that moved through the curved rows of seats. Something that had been causing friction for a long time had been addressed. The machine would run more cleanly now. The herald began the formal declaration. Long sentences. Official language. Marin had heard this done twice before to other species, and had always found it excessive. She waited until he was 3 lines in. Then she stood up. She buttoned the second button on her coat, which she had deliberately left undone for the entire session. She picked up her case from the floor beside her chair. She looked once at the full arc of seats, not with anger, not with sorrow, just looked. The way you look at a place you are making sure to remember accurately. She said 7 words. We'll show ourselves out. Don't call. Then she walked to the door at the back of the chamber, the one that ambassadors used when they needed to move quickly without crossing the main floor. She did not walk fast. She did not look back. The herald had stopped reading. The door was heavy and old, and made a sound when it opened. She went through it. It closed behind her. The sound it made was quiet and complete, the way a decision sounds when it has finally been made. Outside, in the long corridor with the tall windows that looked out over the conclave's central gardens, her aide Priya was waiting with 2 bags already packed and a transport request already filed. How did it go? Priya asked, though she had already been watching the vote feed on her screen and knew exactly how it went. As expected, Marin said. They walked toward the transport bay. The corridor was empty at this hour. The light from the windows fell in long yellow bars across the floor. Priya glanced at her sideways. You smiled. In the chamber. When the count came up. Did I? You did. I was watching on the feed. Marin was quiet for a moment. Their footsteps made a clean, regular sound on the stone floor. They thought they were punishing us, she said. Priya waited. You can't punish someone, Marin said, by letting them leave. She did not explain what she meant. Priya had learned, over 9 years of working alongside her, not to ask when the tone said the sentence was finished. They reached the transport bay. The shuttle was warm inside. It smelled like recycled air and familiarity. Marin sat by the window and watched the conclave's towers grow smaller as they lifted. The building was beautiful from the outside. It always had been. All the real problems with it were interior. She did not feel sadness. She had expected to feel something like sadness, had been braced for it, the way you brace for cold water when you know it's coming. But what she felt instead was lighter than that. Cleaner. Like a tension she had held in her shoulders for so long she had stopped noticing it had finally, quietly, released. She watched the towers until they were gone below the clouds. Then she turned away from the window. There was a great deal of work to do, and she had been waiting a long time to start it. The first 6 months were quiet. Too quiet, some people said, though they said it quietly themselves, in offices and over meals, not in formal sessions. The Galactic Conclave had expelled problematic members before. Usually there were countermotions, threats, demands for review, protests filed through back channels. The expelled party always did something, because doing nothing felt like losing, and no one who had just been voted out of the most powerful body in the known galaxy wanted to feel like they were losing. Humanity did nothing. No ships appeared at the border checkpoints. No diplomatic messages arrived on the official bans. No informal contact came through the back channels that every ambassador kept open for exactly these situations. The human delegation had left the conclave's central station within 48 hours of the vote efficiently, without incident, leaving their offices cleaner than most outgoing delegations managed. And then the door had been, apparently, closed from the inside. The conclave sent 3 polite inquiries. Standard procedure. Checking that communications were functional. The inquiries were received, confirmed, and not answered. The conclave drafted provisional terms for a readmission agreement that humanity had not asked for. The draft sat in a committee. The committee met 4 times. No one came to negotiate. At the 2-month mark, the intelligence office filed a routine monitoring report. Humanity's space was quiet. No unusual military movement. No large energy signatures. No signs of preparation for anything that would require a formal response. The report concluded, in the measured language of professional analysts, that humanity appeared to be taking time to regroup. The analyst who wrote that conclusion was not Saul. Saul worked 3 floors below the intelligence office's main floor, in a section that handled what her department head called infrastructure continuity monitoring, which was a thorough and accurate description of a job that almost no one thought was important. Her work involved watching the conclave's support systems, the unsexy stuff, beacon networks, translation protocol suites, supply lane navigation data, the things that kept the machine running and were therefore never discussed unless they stopped working. In the 3rd month, 3 deep lane shipping corridors started showing navigational drift. It was small, The kind of thing that automated systems flagged and maintenance teams noted and bumped down the priority list. Beacons needed recalibration periodically. It happened. There was a standard process. Saul put in the standard maintenance request. The response came back that the relevant beacon network was not on the maintenance registry. She checked the registry. This was true. She checked the installation records. The beacons had been installed by a human engineering firm under a contract that had expired 2 years ago and been renewed automatically 4 times without anyone reading it. The renewal had been part of a broader human infrastructure agreement that the relevant committee had rubber-stamped in an administrative session and then filed away. She pulled the infrastructure agreement. It was comprehensive. It covered 11 beacon networks, 2 translation relay stations, a data routing hub used by 14 of the 30 conclave member systems, and a navigational mapping service that updated corridor charts every 30 days. All of it built and maintained by human contractors and human automated systems over a period of 80 years. She sat with that for a moment. Then she went looking for the maintenance contracts that covered these systems, now that the agreement had lapsed with the expulsion. There were none. She wrote a short note to her department head flagging the gap. The department head read it, thanked her, and told her the relevant committee would address it in their next session, which was in 6 weeks. Saul marked the issue as pending and went back to her other work. In the 4th month, the translation protocol suite, used by 18 conclave member species, started generating errors. Not big errors. Small ones. Mistranslations in technical documents. A word in the Serenthi commercial dialect rendered as its formal synonym rather than its working-class register, which changed the implied tone of a trade offer. A Dren legal term, given its historical meaning rather than its current one. The kind of errors that a careful reader noticed and an uncautious one didn't, which meant they were exactly the kind of errors that caused long, slow problems, rather than immediate ones. Saul pulled the protocol suite's maintenance logs. The core architecture had been built 40 years ago by a research team at a human university. It was updated quarterly by an automated system that drew from a living language database that the same university had been maintaining ever since, as part of an ongoing academic project that no one had thought to check the status of. She checked the status. The project's human lead had retired. She had retired to the Veth homeworld, one of the Veth families that humanity had quietly relocated 6 months ago, and she had not left a forwarding address. The database had not been updated in 4 months. Saul opened a new document. She started a list. By the end of the 5th month, the list had 23 items on it. Beacon networks, translation systems, supply lane charts, a water purification equipment supply chain that ran through 2 human-owned trading stations, a medical data sharing agreement that had been quietly routing through a human server network, an early warning relay system on the outer border that had been installed by a human military contractor after a territorial dispute 30 years ago and had been running on automated maintenance ever since. None of it was catastrophic. Each item, viewed alone, was manageable. Each item, viewed alone, was the kind of thing that could be fixed with money and time and the right contractors. She looked at the list and thought about what it meant to view it as a whole. She wrote her report. It took 4 days. She was careful with her language. She presented only what she could document. She did not speculate about intent. At the end, she wrote one summary sentence. It read, "We did not expel a member state. We expelled the maintenance crew." She filed the report. 2 days later, her department head called her in. He was not angry. He was something worse than angry. He was mildly embarrassed on her behalf. He told her the report showed good attention to detail, but drew conclusions that were not supported by the evidence. He told her that the issues she had identified were real, but were being addressed by the relevant committees. He told her that characterizing humanity's role in the conclave's infrastructure as systemic or foundational was, at best, an overreading of coincidental data points. He classified the report under a category heading that, in the Dren administrative language, translated as speculative conclusions, no actionable intelligence. Saul thanked him for his time. She went back to her desk. She opened her list and added 2 more items she had found that morning. Then she saved the document under a personal file instead of the department archive. She had the feeling, the way you sometimes do with slow-moving problems, that the relevant committees were not going to address it in time. She had the further feeling, which she kept entirely to herself, that humanity had known this would happen, had known it long before the vote, and had made their decisions accordingly. She could not prove this. She added a note to the bottom of the document. Follow up in 6 months. Then she went back to work. Yusuf Crane had been planning this for 20 years. Not in a dramatic way. Not in the way of someone who holds a grudge and tends it carefully through the years, feeding it and keeping it sharp. More in the way of someone who looks at a situation clearly and honestly for long enough that eventually the obvious next step becomes visible. The obvious next step, in Crane's view, had become visible about 2 decades ago, in a committee meeting that almost no one else remembered. A conclave resource allocation committee. A proposal to establish a joint research fund for pre-spaceflight species identified as potentially viable in the next century. The vote had been 28-3 against. The stated reasons were reasonable. The fund would require significant resources. The timeline was speculative. The criteria for potentially viable were unclear. All of this was true. What was also true, what no one had stated in the meeting, but what Crane had seen clearly in the way the discussion moved, was that the conclave was not built for that kind of patience. It was built for the present moment, for the interests of the species already in the room. The species not yet in the room were, in practice, not anyone's problem. He had gone home from that meeting and started keeping notes. Now, in the 8th month after the expulsion vote, he stood in the central hall of what was going to be called Compact Station 3, and he watched 14 different species conduct business in a corridor that would have seemed impossible 2 years ago. The Veth were easy to spot, small, pale, with a way of moving that still looked slightly surprised by the amount of available space. 6 months on the station, and they were already the best trading partners for 3 of the other species present, which no one in the conclave would have predicted because no one in the conclave had studied them. Crane had sent people to study them. Specifically, he had sent patient people. People who were good at sitting quietly in unfamiliar spaces and waiting for the situation to teach them something. This was, he had found over many years, a skill that was neither common nor valued, but that consistently produced better results than going in with questions already formed. The Veth had a compound in their biology, a natural secretion produced by the organisms they used as a food source that affected the way fold drives calculated spatial compression. The mechanism was complicated, and Crane was not a scientist. What he understood was the practical result. Drives using the compound needed roughly 1/8 the energy to achieve the same fold depth. The conclave scientists had sampled Veth biology twice. Both times they had classified the compound under a category label that meant, essentially, no industrial applications identified. Both times they had moved on. The compound was subtle. Finding its application required patience and the willingness to study a species that had nothing obvious to offer in return. Crane's people had been living on the Veth homeworld for 2 years before they started asking technical questions. By the time they asked, the Veth were already showing them things, rather than waiting to be asked. He thought about this sometimes. The difference between going somewhere to extract information and going somewhere to be present long enough that the information came to you. The conclave had the first method down to a science. Humanity, for all its faults, had always been dangerously good at the second. The Compact Charter had been signed 3 weeks ago. 4 sentences. Every member had the right to free movement and trade within compact space. Every member had mutual defense guarantees from all other members. Every member operated under its own governance, without compact interference. No member required another member's permission to exist. That 4th sentence had been Crane's. The others had been contributed by various delegations in the drafting sessions. The 4th one he had written himself and submitted without discussion, and when it was read aloud in the drafting room, no one had argued with it, because every species in that room had a specific and vivid memory of needing that exact sentence said to them by someone. The compact had 14 members now. 3 were species the conclave had classified as pre-spaceflight primitives, who had, apparently, achieved spaceflight on their own in the years since being dismissed. 2 were former Conclave members who had been quietly pushed out over the decades for reasons that looked, in retrospect, a lot like being inconvenient. The Veth were there. A species called the Kern were there nomadic. Deeply strange, technically brilliant, culturally impossible for the Conclave to negotiate with because their communication style required physical proximity and a 6-hour minimum conversation window that no Conclave committee had ever been willing to schedule. Humanity had scheduled it. Repeatedly. Crane had personally sat through 9 of those 6-hour sessions over the past decade. He had found them genuinely interesting. The infrastructure redirection had been quiet and clean. The beacon networks that had been running on human contracts simply continued running, now routing data primarily through compact systems. The translation protocol suite, once the language database had been taken offline by the retiring academic, was replaced within 2 months by a new one, built on an open architecture that any compact member could update. The supply chains that had run through human trading stations shifted smoothly to serve compact destinations. None of this was sabotage. All of it was property going home. A journalist from one of the independent press services had been given access to the charter signing. She asked Crane, at the end, what humanity wanted from this, what the goal was, what they were trying to prove. He thought about the question for a moment. Not performing thought, actually thinking. We don't want anything from the Conclave, he said. We never did. The journalist waited. She had good instincts and knew when there was more coming. That was always the problem, he said. They assumed we wanted what they had. Their approval, their structure, their way of deciding who counted. They kept waiting for us to want those things, and we kept doing things that only made sense if we didn't. And now? She asked. He looked around the central hall. The Kern were speaking with a Veth trader in a corner, using the slow, proximity-required style that most people found exhausting. They both looked satisfied. A human engineer was walking with 2 members of a species that had no Conclave name because the Conclave had never gotten around to cataloging them. They were gesturing at a structural panel and laughing at something. Now we have a room of our own, Crane said, with a door that opens from the inside. He did not say anything else. The journalist wrote it down. Outside the station's main viewport, against the dark, the running lights of 14 different kinds of ships moved in easy, unscheduled patterns. No formation, no hierarchy, just traffic. Crane watched it for a while. Then he went back to work. The thing had no name when it was first detected. The Conclave's border monitoring system flagged it at the 18-month mark, 3 weeks after the Compact's charter signing, which was either coincidence or the universe's sense of timing being what it was. A spatial anomaly. Moving. Not fast, not slow, a pace that turned urgency into a slow pressure, rather than a crisis, which was almost worse. It absorbed things. That was the simplest way to describe it. Light went in and did not come out. Radio signals went in and did not come out. Probe ships sent to investigate came back with instruments that had recorded nothing, not silence, not static, but nothing, as though the recording function had been working perfectly and simply had no data to show for it. The Conclave Science Division called it the devouring silence, which was more evocative than their usual naming conventions, and which told Saul something about how worried the people who chose the name actually were. It was moving toward 3 Conclave core systems. It would reach the first one in approximately 14 months. The science teams were excellent. Saul knew this. She had read their work for years, quietly admiring its precision. They worked the problem the way they worked every problem. Systematically, building from established principles, running their instruments through the full range of documented spatial phenomena to find the closest match. The instruments came back empty. Every Conclave science vessel shared the same fundamental sensor architecture. Not because anyone had decided this, no single person had ever convened a meeting and said, "Let us standardize our sensors." It had simply happened over 2 centuries of shared research, shared publications, shared equipment manufacturers, shared training programs. The Conclave's scientific community had grown together, and in growing together, had, without quite noticing it, built every ship's eyes from the same set of assumptions about how space communicated. The devouring silence did not communicate in those assumptions. Sal made this point in a memo. She was told the point was speculative. She wrote a longer memo. She was told the longer memo was also speculative, but that it had been forwarded to the relevant division. She did not hear back. She was, at this point, watching the situation from the outside. Her classified report from 6 months earlier had not made her popular in the intelligence office. She was still employed, still doing her work, but the kind of work she was given had gotten smaller, more routine, further from anything consequential. She used the extra time to read the publicly available research on humanity's sensor architecture. It was strange reading, to be honest. Human sensor networks were not elegant. They had been built in layers, over generations. Each new layer added on top of the old one, rather than replacing it. Because replacing things cost money and time, and the old system still mostly worked. The result was redundant, overlapping, inconsistent in places. Multiple instruments measuring the same thing in different ways, producing data that had to be reconciled before it was usable. Every clean-minded engineer in the conclave would have looked at it and seen inefficiency. Sal looked at it and saw something else. The anomaly, as best as anyone could describe it, moved by consuming signal consistency. It fed on regularity. Uniform sensor architecture gave it a clean, consistent signal to absorb. Humanity's overlapping, redundant, inconsistent architecture produced data that was contradictory at the edges. And those contradictions, Sal thought, were exactly what the anomaly could not cleanly process. She could not prove this. She was an infrastructure analyst, not a physicist. But she filed another memo. This one reached, through channels she had not anticipated, a deputy science director who was desperate enough to read it. He called her in. He was not warm, but he was honest, which Sal respected. He told her he could not vouch for her theory, and could not act on it through official channels. He asked if she had any informal contact with Compact representatives. She said she might be able to make an inquiry. The envoy the conclave sent to Compact Station Vethose was a senior ambassador named Theris. He was good at his job. He had been doing it for 30 years. He had navigated treaty collapses, territorial disputes, 3 separate succession crises among conclave member states, and one particularly complicated situation involving a moon that 2 species had independently decided they owned. He had never done anything like this. He prepared extensively. He reviewed every historical record of a great power, making an appeal to a smaller party from a position of need. He prepared arguments. He prepared concessions. He prepared, privately, a script for various versions of the conversation, because Theris was not someone who liked to be caught without a prepared response. He anticipated triumph. He anticipated demands for revenge. He anticipated drawn-out negotiations. He was shown into a conference room that was neither large nor small, furnished plainly, looking out onto a corridor where several species moved past the window in what appeared to be a normal working day. Crane was already there when he arrived. No staff, which was slightly unusual. A glass of water on the table, untouched. Theris sat down. He opened with the formal acknowledgement of the visit and the nature of the request. He used the language he had prepared. He was clear and precise and did not minimize the situation. Crane listened. He did not interrupt. He did not change his expression. When Theris finished, Crane picked up his glass of water, drank from it, and set it down. "We know about it," he said. "We've been watching it for 4 months." Theris processed this. "Our people call it the fold murmur," Crane said, "because that's what it sounds like on our instruments before it gets close. A murmur. Harmless seeming. Can you model it?" Theris asked. "We can do more than model it." Crane picked up a thin document from the table. Theris had not noticed it was there and slid it across. "We can give you a full navigational map of its behavior patterns, a predictive model good to within 11 days, and an active disruption method that our ships have already tested on the outer edge." Theris looked at the document. He looked at Crane. "There's a bill," Crane said. "Name it. 3 permanent seats on a joint navigation and early warning body, co-equal with any seats held by conclave members." Recognition written, formal, entered into the permanent record of the Compact of Free Worlds as a sovereign galactic entity, requiring no license or approval from any other body. He paused. And a written retraction of the expulsion declaration. Not an apology. We don't need an apology. Just the administrative correction. Theris had expected a harder number. He had expected more anger wrapped around it. The calm was the thing he found he could not prepare for. This was not triumph. It was not revenge dressed up in neutral language. It was a transaction. Crane was not enjoying this. He was not suffering through it. He was doing it the way a competent professional handles a piece of necessary business, clearly, without theater, and with the full intention of then moving on to the next thing. That's acceptable, Theris said. Good. Crane stood. We'll have ships at the first corridor point within 10 days. They shook hands. Crane's grip was firm and brief. He was already looking slightly past Theris in the way of someone whose mind has moved to the logistics of the task. Theris walked back to his shuttle. He sat down and looked out the window at the station's exterior. He had met many great figures in his career. He had met people who wielded power with pleasure, and people who wielded it with sorrow, and people who wielded it with the kind of careful discretion that came from knowing how heavy it was. He had not before met someone who simply wielded it, with no visible relationship to the power itself at all, as though it were neither burden nor prize, just a tool, and the tool was presently needed, and when the job was done, the tool would go back on the shelf. He filed his report on the flight back. He struggled for a long time with how to describe the meeting. In the end, he wrote only, "Terms were reached. They were reasonable. I believe they already knew we were going to ask." He deleted the last sentence before submitting. Then he added it back. 5 years was long enough for things to settle into the shape they were going to hold. The devouring silence, the fold murmur, as the Compact's charts still called it, had been resolved in 9 weeks. 3 compact ships, 3 human crews, a disruption method that the Conclave's scientists studied afterward with an attention that suggested they found it embarrassing that they hadn't thought of it. The method was not complicated. It relied on producing specifically inconsistent signal patterns in the path of the anomaly, the opposite of the clean, regular data it fed on, and doing it from enough angles simultaneously that the anomaly had nothing coherent to absorb. The Conclave's clean, unified sensor architecture could not produce the necessary inconsistency. Humanity's messy, overlapping, never fully standardized sensor architecture produced almost nothing but. After the crisis, the Compact published the full technical record, navigation data, predictive models, disruption protocols, available to anyone. The anomaly was named in the Joint Navigation Body's records, a name chosen by the Veth astronomer who had first identified it on compact instruments 4 months before the Conclave detected it. It sat now in the early warning database, like a lesson that no one had quite finished learning the implications of. The Joint Navigation Body held its first formal session 6 months after the agreement was signed. 3 compact seats. The representatives were a human engineer, a Kern navigator, and a Veth scientist who had been studying the fold murmur since the beginning. They attended every session. They did their work. They were not dramatic about any of it. 2 Conclave member species applied for compact membership in the 2nd year. Their applications were processed under the standard charter procedure, which was thorough and unhurried, and treated both applicants as equal to any founding member. They joined. The Compact grew. The Conclave still existed. It was smaller, quieter, and had the institutional quality of something that had survived a significant event and was still figuring out what it was going to be afterward. Some member states had started quietly updating their infrastructure contracts, this time reading the agreements before filing them. Marin Ose lived on a Veth agricultural station called Seville, which sat in a warm orbit around a mid-sized star and produced, among other things, a fruit that tasted like nothing she had grown up eating, and that she had spent 3 years developing a fondness for. She had a garden. It was not a metaphor. It was a real garden, approximately 40 square meters, in which she was currently attempting to grow a hybrid grain that had never been grown outside a controlled laboratory environment. She was not succeeding. She was finding this interesting. The historian who came to see her was named Odal. She was Rethian Sal's species, though they had not met, though they knew of each other. She was writing what she called The first serious account of the expulsion and the 5 years that followed. She had been working on it for 2 years. She had spoken to Theris, to Crane, to 3 of the 14 original Compact Charter signatories, to the deputy science director who had read Saul's memo, to the Veth astronomer who named the fold murmur. She had saved Marin for last. They sat in the garden. In 2 chairs Marin had placed under a shade panel, and Marin poured something cold that Odal did not recognize, and that turned out to be good. Odal had her recorder and her prepared questions. She was precise, thorough, and had a quality Marin recognized. Immediately she asked the question she actually wanted answered, rather than the safer version of it. They talked for an hour about the mechanics of it, the 20 years of quiet groundwork, the infrastructure that no one had cataloged, the Veth compound, and the fold drive implications, the Compact's charter, and how the 4th sentence came to be in it, the fold murmur, and the sensor architecture question. Odal recorded all of it carefully. Then she put the recorder on her knee and asked the question she had been building toward. "I want to ask about the chamber," she said. "The vote. The moment you left. There are 3 different accounts of what your face looked like when the count came up. I want to know what you were actually thinking." Marin looked at her garden. The hybrid grain she was failing to grow occupied the far right section, behind a low barrier she'd installed to protect it from a local animal that had not respected its existence. "I've been asked that before," she said. "I know. I've read the other answers. I don't think any of them were wrong. I think there's more." Marin was quiet for a moment. The air on Sayvel had a particular weight to it in the afternoon, heavier than most places she had lived, not unpleasantly so. She had grown used to it. She had grown used to most things here. "They thought they were punishing us," she said. "That's the first thing I thought, when the count came up, that every face in that room believed what was happening was a punishment." She picked up her glass. "You can't punish someone by releasing them from a cage they've been politely pretending was a room." Odal wrote this down. "The smirk," Odal said. "Multiple accounts mention a smirk. Your aide describes it. The feed footage shows it." "What was that?" "It was for us," Marin said simply. "Not for them. They just happened to be facing the right direction to see it." She set her glass down. "We had been in that room for a long time," she said, "adjusting ourselves to fit a space that was never built to contain us. Not out of weakness, we made real contributions there. But there's a difference between contributing to something and being shaped by it. We had started to get shaped by it." She paused. The smirk was the feeling of stopping. Odal asked several more questions. Marin answered them honestly and without drama. After another hour, Odal thanked her, packed her recorder, and said she thought the book would be finished within the year. After Odal left, Marin sat in the garden for a while longer. Across the common area of the station, she could hear children. A sound she had gotten used to. There were more of them every season, as Seville grew. She could not see them from the garden, but she could hear the specific quality of their noise, which was the quality of children who had no particular reason to be quiet and were not being quiet. Some of them were human children. Some of them were Veth. Some of them were of species she would have needed to look up by name 5 years ago, but could now identify by voice. They went to school together, in a building 2 corridors over, that held classes in 14 languages, because the population required it, and no one had thought to argue about which one should be primary. They argued about plenty of other things, the way children did, but not that. They did not know the word conclave, except as something in a history lesson that some of them had not gotten to yet. This was not because anyone had hidden it from them. It was simply not the most relevant thing in their world, and children, in Marin's experience, had an accurate instinct for what was and wasn't relevant. She thought about the chamber sometimes. The pale ceiling, the light that came in wrong, the particular silence before a vote. She did not miss it. She checked on the hybrid grain. Still not succeeding. Still interesting. She made a note of what the soil looked like and what she might try differently next week. There was, she had found, always a next thing. She had been waiting a long time to find out what hers was. The garden was a reasonable answer. She was not in a hurry to finalize it. The children's noise continued across the common area, unhurried, unconcerned with anything beyond the immediate business of being alive on a warm station in a good orbit, with nowhere particular to be and the whole afternoon still ahead. She listened to it for a while. Then she went inside to make dinner.